the Financial Times. The Financial Times wrote up an interview with Gunther Verheugen, the former industry commissioner. And the headline was, European regulation costs 600 billion euros a year. He never said that. That's the first thing. He never said that. He was referring to a cut in the administrative cost of regulation, which would set off dynamic effects which would lead to a 25% increase in EU GDP, which was equivalent to 150 billion, which would have been equivalent to 150 billion euros. They took that to mean that this was the cost of a regulation in the EU is 600 billion euros. I mean, that has been flying around. I saw it in the Daily Mail quite recently. That was the FT being the source of that euro. Did you guys follow me there? So, the cost of regulation, I don't know if you should write about this actually. I'll send you links and information. Yeah. And you can debunk the great in the UK. Oh, yeah. I mean, the regulation thing, because I mean that's when you get outside the realms of bog standard net and gross contributions and the value of the EU or otherwise to the economy, and that is one of the things which is just so much. I know you guys did something with like 72% of the cost of regulation comes from the EU or something, and then there was this other group which have done their own research elsewhere, and it's 0.1%.
Well, let me break that down. Let me break that down for you. So what we did, because this goes to the heart of Europe, again, we formed as a citizen, as a blogger. So I will explain that to you now. If you want to take notes. So our figure was based on 2,300 of the government's own impact assessments, dating back to 1980.
No, research was you had the stats and everything.
Yeah, but it's not on that. I'm trying to explain the discrepancy in the figures that they're right about. And that referred to the cost of EU regulation arising in any given year, stemming from regulation introduced since 1998. It sounds very technical and boring, but it's a crucial difference to the British Chamber of Commerce figure which is used, which referred to the net added cost of regulation introduced only in 07-08. So you're comparing apples and oranges. And for an award-winning blog post, you would think that you would take it into account.
Right. Well, the point of all of this is that you can.
So you
I mean, this is the thing. I mean, that is the whole problem. There isn't a standard way of assessing most of this stuff. I mean, your figures.
No, but that's just comparing apples with apples and oranges with oranges. It's not standard. It's just looking at what they actually try to show.
Well, but the whole thing is, I mean, you can go through God knows how many bits of legislation and regulations and working out the actual impact of any regulation on an economy is practically impossible. You know how complex the British economy is, the European economy is. If you're sort of entering one little bit of regulation in depth or trying to work out what impact does this have, it's how can you do it without a control group to see what would happen if you didn't have that regulation? And how can you do any of this assessment when you're talking about however many thousand pieces of EU legislation it is? How many of those would have been passed at the national level if they hadn't been passed at the EU level? And all this sort of thing. So it's sort of, saying that you've got this 72% or whatever it is, but what percentage of that would have been passed anyway if we weren't part of the EU? And these sorts of things you just can't work out.
No, but that's, sorry, can I just very quickly
Yes,
I know it's very technical, but it's extremely interesting. These are all valid points, but it's very useful still to do that exercise because we need to know where the regulation is locked in. Yeah. In terms of accountability, we need to sort of know where is it now, what level of government are they regulating at in this particular area. And that's extremely important because it links to the heart of democracy and the democratic deficit in the European Union. So about the exercise that we did, we actually identified the percentage of the cost of regulation that is locked in at the EU. We didn't say that none of these would have existed in the first place, because that would be impossible. The counterfactual is absolutely possible to determine. But we said, look, this is how much impact it has in the regulatory sphere. Which areas are appropriate for the EU to deal with of these various costs? And then we can have an informed discussion. Yeah. So I take your points, but I also think it's very useful.
And this is another sort of slight problem with the whole way he approaches this, because I mean, Open Europe does some good work, definitely.
Thank you.
But there is a definite Eurosceptic bent to pretty much everything that Open Europe does. And what we haven't got in the UK is a pro-EU equivalent. They're just, I mean, we used to have like what Britain in Europe or Business for Europe, whatever it is, and they were all rubbish, and they've all pretty much died. And if anybody comes out and tries to counter any of this stuff with their own research, normally the only way you can do it is actually by getting EU funding, which instantly makes you suspect at the very least, and you get accused of propaganda. It's like we should put out this new website, I can't remember what the name of it was, Fantasia's around somewhere, she could probably tell us, which, you know, trying to counter some of the myths about the EU and all this sort of thing. And
EU wasn't it for me.
yeah, that's the one. EU wasn't it for me. And it's meant to be a sort of nice little education sort of thing, and like how can you find out decent information? But it's coming from the source itself, it's coming from the institutions, it's coming from the EU. It's propaganda, instantly. It's never going to convince anybody of a sceptical bent, because from day one, you know it's coming from these corrupt people in Brussels, bureaucrats who are trying to constantly do all sorts of things. And what you need is a completely independent organisation which is trying to do this stuff off its own bat. And who the hell's going to fund that? I mean, it's just, it's very, I mean, even though you've got quite a decent chunk of large businesses who are actually pro-EU, they're just not prepared to do it because they know that their money is better spent lobbying people in Brussels. They don't need to win over the public, they need to win over all these Brussels bureaucrats. So, you know, the public aren't being sold because it doesn't really affect the public in the same way that national politics does. You don't rely on the public for a vote, so, you know, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the public are Eurosceptic as long as the people in power know what they're doing.
Which just demonstrates the democratic deficit, doesn't it? The final EU myth, obviously, was that the euro would lead to economic stability.
Depends which version of the euro.
Well, we only have one euro.
Well, yeah, but it's nicer if one everyone wants it.
Pound went to economic stability. Has the pound led to economic stability?
It wasn't claimed that the pound would lead to economic stability, it was claimed that the euro would lead to economic stability, wasn't it?
Let me final round of questions before we move on to questions from the audience. Just briefly, what do you think of with the general election, the new coalition government coming to power? Has it changed the sort of media landscape and how people talk about the EU? Tories being notoriously sort of Eurosceptic.
Yeah, they've got terrible press for being Eurosceptic when actually they're closetly Europhile. William Hague is trading on past laurels as a Eurosceptic. He isn't really nowadays. And there's a lot of trading going on. I assume that the Tories are going to win a rebate, and there'll obviously be some horse trading to pay for that rebate elsewhere that the press won't understand because they treat the subject much more shallow. I'm sure Open Europe will start it that.
Would you like to respond? No?
Well, yeah, I think it's pretty much realities of power. It's all very well sort of ranting about, you know, I've won as much when you're in opposition, but when you get into power, you actually have to deal with them on a daily basis and you realise just how much this, you know, the government is hooked into the EU in various incredibly impenetrable ways. You sort of realise you have to be a little bit more careful in the things you say. You can't just charge around doing the populist nonsense that Hague liked to spout off when he was shadow foreign secretary.
Yeah, but I also think that politics has changed a bit in Britain as well, possibly to the better in terms of, you know, it's not a bad thing necessarily to have a coalition government because it allows you to take a more nuanced view of some of these things. But no, I agree with you. I mean, once in government, it's very tricky to remain a raging Eurosceptic because of the reality of having to negotiate with these people on a daily basis. It's very difficult. There are very few genuinely Eurosceptic governments.